There are men who walk into a room and change everything, not because they planned to, not because they were invited to, but because the room had no other choice. Ethan Walker was not supposed to matter. He was a temp, a nobody, a grieving father who'd buried his ambitions alongside his wife and spent 3 years pretending that was enough. But on the morning that a $2 billion contract stood at the edge of collapse, with lawyers exhausted, executives sweating through their shirts, and a CEO watching her life's work begin to crack, it was the temp who raised his hand and said quietly, "Give me 10 minutes." The room laughed. They shouldn't have. If you've never seen a stranger walk into a disaster and come out the other side carrying something nobody else could find, stay with me, because that's exactly what this story is. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, hit that like button, and drop a comment right now telling me what city and country you're watching from. I want to know how far this story has traveled. Don't go anywhere, because what happens next in this boardroom is just the beginning of something none of these people saw coming. The morning started badly and got worse by degrees. Ethan Walker woke at 5:43 because his daughter had climbed into his bed sometime during the night, and her elbow was in his ribs. He lay there for a few minutes in the dark, listening to Sophie breathe, one small arm thrown across his chest like she was anchoring herself to something. She was 7. She still did that sometimes, climbed in without waking him, tucked herself against his side like she'd done when she was 3 and afraid of storms. He didn't mind. He'd stopped minding a long time ago. He got up carefully, pulled the blanket back over her, and stood in the dim kitchen making coffee and staring at nothing in particular while the machine gurgled and hissed. Their apartment was small. It was always either too hot or too cold, depending on which neighbor had control of the building's ancient heating system. The refrigerator had a rattle in it that he kept meaning to fix. On the counter beside the sink sat a piece of paper with Sophie's handwriting on it, a drawing of a stick figure in a tie, presumably him, standing next to what he thought might be a building. She'd written, "Good luck, Daddy, new job," in purple crayon, with 3 exclamation points and a lopsided star. He folded it and put it in his breast pocket. He'd taken the temp job out of necessity, which was the only honest reason to take any job you wouldn't have chosen otherwise. The contract was through a staffing agency, 60 days, possibly extending to 90, working in the administrative and support division of Novatech Systems, one of the largest technology firms in the country. He didn't know much about the company beyond what was publicly available. He didn't especially care. He needed income that was stable enough to cover Sophie's school costs, their rent, and the physical therapy sessions his knees still required after a car accident 18 months prior that had left him with a limp. He mostly ignored. I was 32 years old and felt 45. That was fine. He'd made peace with that. The Novatech headquarters was a 40-minute commute by train, which gave him time to read. He brought a paperback and a thermos and sat by the window and watched the city pass in the gray early light. Around him, other people stared at their phones or dozed or scrolled through things that made them frown. He read his book and drank his coffee and didn't think about much. The lobby of Novatech was the kind of lobby designed to make you feel small, all glass and steel and polished concrete, with the company's logo suspended in the air above the reception desk in backlit letters that were probably meant to communicate vision and permanence. Ethan showed his ID, collected his visitor badge, and was escorted to HR on the 14th floor by a young woman who walked very fast and apologized twice for walking very fast. "It's a little hectic today," she said, pressing the elevator button repeatedly, as though that would make it arrive sooner. "What kind of hectic?" he asked. She looked at him sideways. "The kind where you hope you're not in a particular conference room on the 22nd floor. He didn't ask what that meant. He found out anyway. By 9:15, he had a desk, a laptop. He couldn't log into yet because IT hadn't processed his credentials, a stack of onboarding documents, and a clear view through the glass partition into the hallway that connected the administrative floor to the central elevator bank. People were moving through that hallway with the particular urgency of people who are trying very hard not to run. A man in a gray suit walked past carrying a binder so thick it looked architectural. 2 women with badges identifying them as from the legal division followed him, talking in low, sharp tones. Someone's phone rang and wasn't answered. Ethan's assigned supervisor, a tired-looking man in his mid-40s named Dennis, dropped a folder on his desk without making eye contact. There's nothing for you to actually do yet because your system access won't be active until tomorrow at the earliest, Dennis said. So just, sit there. Read the onboarding materials. Don't go to the 22nd floor. Why does everyone keep saying that? Dennis finally looked at him. There were shadows under his eyes that suggested he hadn't slept particularly well. Because that's where they're trying to save the Meridian contract, and it's not going well, and everyone above a certain pay grade is up there having what I can only describe as a very expensive panic attack. What's the Meridian contract? Dennis stared at him for a moment with the expression of someone who has just realized the new person genuinely doesn't know, which is somehow more exhausting than if they'd been pretending. $2.4 billion, he said. International tech licensing deal with Meridian Global out of Singapore. Months of negotiation. Supposed to close this week. Except now it's not closing because there's some legal provision. Their team is hanging on that our lawyers say we can't agree to without violating domestic regulatory code. He paused. If it doesn't close, the company takes a hit that it's not good. It's really not good. He walked away before Ethan could respond. Ethan spent an hour and 40 minutes reading the onboarding materials, which were thorough in the way that documents written by a committee are always thorough, covering everything and saying very little. He drank the remainder of his thermos coffee. He reread Sophie's crayon note. He looked out the window at the city spread below him, gray-skied and ordinary and indifferent. Then he got up and went to find a printer, because his laptop still wasn't active, and he figured the onboarding documents would be easier to annotate on paper. In looking for the printer, he made a wrong turn and ended up near the elevator bank, where a set of documents had been left on a small table near the recycling bin. Pages and pages, dense with legal language. The top sheet stamped Meridian Global Contract, Draft 7, Confidential. Someone had left them there. He could see the copy room 20 feet away, door open, printer visible. Someone had been making copies and hadn't picked up all of them. He stood there for a moment. He picked them up and brought them back to his desk. I wasn't supposed to be reading them. He understood that clearly. They were marked confidential, and he was a temp on his first day with no system access and no particular standing in the company. The appropriate thing to do would have been to flag Dennis, or to bring them to reception, or to set them on some senior person's desk with a polite note. He read them instead. Not quickly. Carefully. The way he'd trained himself years ago, before everything fell apart, before Claire died and he sold the firm and moved Sophie into a smaller apartment and told himself the smaller life was the right life, the safe life, the life where he couldn't lose anything else because there was nothing left to lose. The contract was complex, written in the layered, recursive language of international commercial law, full of cross-references and conditional clauses and defined terms that referred to other defined terms. He read through it twice, making small marks with a pen in the margins, not because he intended to do anything with his notes, but because that was how his mind worked, and he'd never quite managed to break the habit. He was on his third pass through Section 14, a subsection dealing with intellectual property licensing and territorial exclusivity, when something stopped him. He went back and read it again. Then he sat very still for almost a full minute. Section 14C, cross-referenced with the regulatory provision in Appendix D, contained a clause that could be read in two ways depending on which jurisdiction's definition of derivative works you applied. The Meridian team was clearly reading it under Singaporean commercial framework. Novatech's lawyers were assuming the clause was fixed under domestic IP law, but the clause itself, in its original language, didn't specify jurisdiction. It used a phrase, in accordance with applicable standards of the originating territory, that was vague enough to support an alternative reading that would satisfy both parties without requiring either of them to concede the underlying point. It was a loophole, or more precisely, it was a gap, a place where the contract's language had been sloppy in a way that could either doom the deal or save it, depending entirely on how you used it. Ethan sat back in his chair. He thought about Sophie's drawing with the lopsided star. Then he picked up his phone and called Dennis. "You want to do what?" Dennis said. "I want 10 minutes with whoever is running the negotiation meeting on 22. You're a temp. I know. You started 4 hours ago. I know that too. You don't even have system access yet." "Dennis," Ethan kept his voice level, "I understand how this sounds. I'm asking for 10 minutes. If I'm wrong, you never have to listen to me again, and I will sit at this desk and read onboarding documents until my contract expires. But I think I found something." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "What did you find?" Dennis asked finally. "I'd rather explain it upstairs. I need to show people who can actually verify it." Another silence. Longer this time. "I'm going to regret this," Dennis said. "Stay there." They wouldn't let him in at first. The conference room on the 22nd floor was occupied by 12 people who collectively represented more legal and executive experience than Ethan had accumulated in his entire working life. There were 3 senior partners from the company's outside law firm, 2 members of the internal legal team, 4 members of the executive board, a financial consultant who'd been flown in from New York, and the company's chief operating officer, Marcus Webb, who was a large man with a manner that suggested he was accustomed to being the most important person in any room he entered. And there was Victoria Hayes. Ethan had seen her photograph in the onboarding materials. The CEO, 30 years old, the youngest person to ever hold the position at Novatech. The photograph had shown a woman with precise posture and an expression that gave nothing away. In person, she was seated in her wheelchair at the head of the conference table, and she looked exactly like someone who had spent the last 6 hours watching something she'd spent years building begin to come apart at the seams. Her face was controlled, but her eyes, dark, watchful, working through something constantly. Those were the eyes of a person holding herself together by force of will. She was the one who said, "Let him in." Marcus Webb turned to look at her. "Victoria, I heard what Dennis said. He found something." She looked at Ethan through the glass. 10 minutes, she said, and her voice was flat and clear and didn't invite argument. The door opened. Ethan walked in with his marked-up printed copy of the contract, which suddenly felt very flimsy in his hand. 12 pairs of eyes turned toward him. Several people immediately looked skeptical. One of the outside lawyers, a woman with silver-framed glasses and the expression of someone who had seen many people embarrass themselves in conference rooms, looked at the annotated printout and then back at Ethan with the particular patience of a person waiting for something they've already decided to dismiss. "You're the temp," Webb said. "Yes." "And you think you found something our legal team missed?" Ethan didn't answer that directly. "I found something worth looking at," he said. "Whether it's something your legal team already considered and rejected, I don't know. But it took me about 2 hours to find it, so." He set the papers on the table and turned to the relevant page. "Section 14C, he said. "The phrase in accordance with applicable standards of the originating territory. Your legal team has been treating this as fixed under domestic IP law because that's the default assumption in a contract formed within this jurisdiction. Meridian's team is reading it under Singaporean commercial framework because that's their default. But the phrase doesn't specify jurisdiction. It uses originating territory, which in the context of the licensing agreement could reasonably refer to the territory of origin of the specific intellectual property being licensed, not the territory of the agreement itself." Silence in the room. The woman with the silver glasses had stopped looking patient and started looking at the page. "If you apply that reading," Ethan continued, "then the licensing exclusivity clause in 14C can be structured as a tiered territorial arrangement rather than an absolute grant. Meridian gets the exclusivity they want in the Asia-Pacific markets. Novatech retains the domestic regulatory compliance they need. Neither party has to concede the core position they've been defending." More silence. Victoria Hayes was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not skepticism, not belief either. Something more careful than either. One of the internal lawyers pulled the contract toward him and read the section, then read it again. He looked up at the woman with the silver glasses. Something passed between them, something that might have been the professional equivalent of, "Oh." "That's not settled law," the woman said to Ethan. "The originating territory interpretation has been tested in Singaporean courts, but it's not a dominant reading domestically." "No," he agreed, "but it's a legitimate reading. And if both parties agree to adopt it as the operative framework for Section 14, you don't need it to be dominant law. You need the other side to accept it." "And why would Meridian accept it?" Ethan looked at the financial consultant from New York, who had been very quiet. "Because their own draft, I'm assuming there's a copy of their most recent counterproposal somewhere in this room, their draft uses the same phrase in Section 9. in the exclusivity language. If you show them that their preferred reading of originating territory in Section 14 is actually consistent with how they've been using the same term in Section 9, you're not asking them to accept your interpretation. You're asking them to be consistent with their own. The financial consultant looked at the papers in front of him. He flipped several pages. His jaw tightened very slightly, which was the only indication he gave that he'd just found what Ethan was describing. Victoria said, "Pull up the Meridian draft, Section 9. Someone pulled it up. The room went very quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before. Webb leaned forward. He read it. He sat back. He looked at Ethan with an expression that was not quite respect and not quite fury, but somewhere in the middle, which was its own complicated thing to see on a man like Marcus Webb. "He's right," said the woman with the silver glasses. Her voice was careful, professional, stripped of any tone that might indicate how she actually felt about being the person to say those words. The Section 9 usage creates an argument for consistent application. It's not airtight, but it's real. "Can we get Meridian's team back on the call?" Victoria asked. "They were supposed to be done with us," someone said. "Get them on the call," she said again. Not loudly, just firmly. Ethan took a step back toward the door. His 10 minutes were up and more than up, and he understood that his role in this particular moment was finished. "Wait," Victoria said. He stopped. "Stay in the room," she said. "I might have questions." He stayed. The call with Meridian's team lasted 90 minutes. Ethan stood near the back wall, near a credenza holding a coffee machine that nobody was using, and he listened. He didn't speak again except twice. Once, when Victoria looked at him directly and said, "The Section 9 consistency argument. Walk me through the exact language again." And once, when one of the Meridian lawyers pushed back on the territorial definition, and Ethan quietly said which paragraph in their own counterproposal addressed the point, and the room absorbed this and used it. By 11:45, the Meridian team had agreed to resume formal discussions under the modified interpretive framework. It was not a signed deal. It was an agreement to keep talking, which was a different thing. But 45 minutes earlier, it had been an agreement to stop talking, which was a different thing still. When the call ended and the room began to decompress in the specific way of people who have just survived something they weren't sure they would survive, loosened collars and exhaled breath, and the particular slump of shoulders finally released from tension, Webb looked at Ethan for a long moment without saying anything. Then he said, "I'll want a full written analysis by end of day." He walked out. Several others followed. The lawyers convened at the far end of the table, talking in low tones, already pulling apart the path forward. The financial consultant shook Ethan's hand, which was not something Ethan had expected, and said, "Nice catch," in a tone that was genuinely flat and not sarcastic, which was perhaps the most professional compliment available in that register. Victoria remained at the head of the table. When most of the room had cleared, she looked at him. "Ethan Walker," she said, reading from something on her tablet. "Hired as a temporary administrative support contractor. Started this morning." "Yes." "You read a confidential contract draft that you weren't supposed to have access to." "Someone left pages near the copy room," he said. "I should have flagged it immediately. I didn't." "No," she said. "You didn't." She set the tablet down. "Why not?" He thought about it. The honest answer was complicated. Something about old habits, about the way his brain worked when it found something it recognized, about the fact that for a few hours this morning he had felt, for the first time in a very long time, like something other than a man treading water. He didn't say any of that. "Because I thought it mattered," he said. She studied him for a moment with those watchful eyes. "Go write Webb's analysis," she said. "Use the conference room down the hall. I'll have it get you temporary elevated access." She turned back to her tablet. "And Walker?" "Yes?" "Don't leave a copy at the printer next time." He almost smiled. He didn't quite. He went to find the conference room, and the afternoon outside the windows was still gray, and the city below was still indifferent, and in his breast pocket was a crayon drawing of a stick figure in a tie, standing next to something that might have been a building, and Ethan Walker sat down at a borrowed table with borrowed access and started to write. The written analysis he delivered to Marcus Webb at 4:57 that afternoon was 11 pages long, single-spaced, and covered not only the Section 14 interpretive framework, but 3 additional risk vectors in the contract that nobody had flagged during the original negotiation process. Ethan had found them the same way he'd found the first one, by reading carefully, by taking nothing for granted, by treating every defined term as a question rather than an answer. He left the printed copy on Webb's assistant's desk because Webb himself had left early, which told Ethan something about the man, though he wasn't sure yet exactly what. He took the train home. Sophie was at the neighbor's apartment. Mrs. Delgado, 2 doors down, a retired schoolteacher who watched Sophie on late days for $20 and always sent her home with something baked. Sophie came through the door at 6:30, carrying a plastic bag with 3 oatmeal cookies in it, and talking without pause about something that had happened at school involving a girl named Priya and a red crayon, and what was apparently a significant misunderstanding about whose turn it was to draw the class rabbit. Ethan listened. He made pasta. He sat across from her at their small kitchen table and watched her eat and talk at the same time, which was a habit he'd been meaning to address for 2 years and kept not addressing because he didn't actually mind it. "How was the new job?" she asked, between bites. "Interesting," he said. She looked at him. She had her mother's eyes, dark and direct and a little too perceptive for someone her age. Good interesting or bad interesting? He thought about a conference room full of expensive people going quiet. "Good interesting," he said. She seemed satisfied with that and went back to telling him about Priya and the crayon. He did the dishes after she went to bed, standing at the sink in the quiet apartment, and he thought about Section 14 and the phrase originating territory. And the look on Victoria Hayes's face when the Meridian team had finally agreed to keep talking. It was not a look of triumph. It was more complicated than that. The look of someone who had held on by her fingernails and knew it, and wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or frightened that the holding on had worked. He dried his hands and went to bed and was asleep before 9, which was the earliest he'd slept in months. The next morning, Dennis met him at the elevator with an expression that suggested something had changed. "Victoria wants to see you at 8:30, Dennis said. "Okay." "In her office. Not a conference room. Her office." "Is that significant?" Dennis looked at him with the specific exhaustion of a man who has worked in corporate environments long enough to understand that yes, it is always significant where the meeting happens. And no, he did not have time to explain the entire taxonomy of meeting locations and what they communicate. "Just don't be late," he said. Victoria's office was on the 24th floor, which was the top floor, which Ethan had known from the building directory, but which felt different as a physical reality when the elevator opened onto a hallway that was noticeably quieter and better lit than the floors below. The carpet was thicker. The art on the walls was actual art, not prints. A woman named Carol, who was Victoria's executive assistant, looked him over with the careful neutrality of someone whose job requires accurate first impressions, decided something about him, and said, "Go right in." The office was large but not ostentatious. One wall was entirely glass, looking out over the city. A long work table ran along one side, covered in documents and 2 open laptops and a coffee cup that looked like it had been there a while. Victoria was behind the main desk, on the phone, and she held up one finger when he entered, not impatiently, just efficiently, and finished the call in 90 seconds with 3 sentences that sounded like they concluded something that had been in progress for a while. She set the phone down and looked at him. "Sit down, Walker." He sat. She had his 11-page analysis on the desk in front of her, and he could see from across the desk that it had been read. Actually read, with marks on it. The margins annotated in a small, precise handwriting that was clearly hers. "The 3 additional risk vectors," she said. Sections 8, 19, and the indemnification schedule in Appendix F. "Yes. You flagged those last night. They were in the contract. I thought it was worth noting." She looked at him for a moment. "Our legal team has been working on this contract for 14 weeks, she said. 3 outside firms, 2 financial consultants. She didn't say and you found things they missed, but it was present in the sentence anyway, taking up space. "I want to know who you are," she said. "I'm a temporary administrative contractor." "That's what your badge says." She folded her hands on the desk. "I'm asking something else." He was quiet for a moment. Outside the glass wall, the city was just starting to fill with morning light, gray burning off at the edges to something that might become blue if the weather held. "I used to run a business consulting firm," he said. "Meridian-adjacent work. contract strategy, negotiation structuring, risk analysis for mid-sized companies getting into international agreements. Started it when I was 26. Built it to about 40 employees over 3 years. What happened to it? I sold it. Why? He looked at a point just past her shoulder. My wife died. I had a 7-year-old. I needed to simplify. Victoria didn't say she was sorry, which he appreciated more than she probably knew. People who said they were sorry did it because it was what you were supposed to say, and he'd heard it approximately 400 times, and it had never once made him feel anything except aware of what he'd lost. What she said was, "And since then? Since then I've been doing what I needed to do, which is work you're significantly overqualified for. It pays reliably." She studied him. He had the impression she was running through a calculation, not about him specifically, but about what he represented as a problem she hadn't anticipated and now had to account for. "I pulled your file this morning," she said. "Your contract is through the staffing agency, 60 days with an option to extend. You have no NDA with Novatech directly, which means technically you're not bound by our internal confidentiality agreements beyond what the agency contract specifies." She paused. "I want to change that. I want to bring you on directly, short-term consulting contract, not administrative support. 2 weeks, renewable. Scope to be determined, but initially, you finish the Meridian deal with our legal team." Ethan said nothing. "The hourly rate would be substantially different from what the agency is paying you," she said, and named a figure. He kept his face still. The figure was more than double what the agency contract paid, which was already more than he'd been making before it. "I'm not a lawyer," he said. "I know that. I don't need another lawyer. I have lawyers." She said it without contempt, just factually, the way you'd say I have a hammer, I need something else. "I need someone who reads contracts the way you read contracts and thinks about what they mean in practice rather than in precedent." Webb won't like it. Something moved across her face, brief, controlled, and then gone. "Marcus Webb's preferences are noted," she said, which was not a denial. "I need to think about it," Ethan said. Victoria blinked, and he had the impression that this was not the response she'd been expecting, and that she was recalibrating. "All right," she said. "Can I have until tomorrow morning?" "Yes." He stood up. He was almost at the door when she said, "Walker." He turned. "The indemnification issue in Appendix F," she said. "If Meridian pushes back on the revised Section 14 framework and we have to go to fallback, is there a workable structure in there, or is it actually as bad as it looks?" He considered it. "It's bad," he said. "But there's a restructuring that limits the exposure to domestic assets only if you're willing to carve out the Singapore IP portfolio as a separate vehicle before signing. It's complicated, and it needs a tax attorney as much as a contracts person. But it's workable." She wrote something down. "Tomorrow morning," she said, and went back to her work. He took the job. The reasons were practical, and he was honest with himself about the fact that they were mostly practical. The money mattered, and it mattered in concrete ways that had nothing to do with pride. Sophie's school had a science enrichment program that cost $400 a semester, and the apartment building had sent a notice about a maintenance assessment, and his car needed brake work that he'd been putting off for 2 months. The money was real, and the reasons were real. But there was something else, and he was also honest about that. Something had come awake in him in that conference room, standing at the back wall near the unused coffee machine. Some part of him that he had packed away 3 years ago and told himself he didn't need anymore. The part that was good at this, genuinely good. The part that felt the specific satisfaction of finding the hidden shape of a problem and turning it so the light hit it differently. He had missed it. He hadn't let himself miss it for a long time. But standing there in the 22nd floor conference room while 12 expensive professionals absorbed something he'd found in 2 hours on a borrowed printout, he'd felt it again. He wasn't sure yet if that was a good thing. He put the question aside. The next 2 weeks were the most exhausting and clarifying of his professional life since the early days of his own firm, when everything was urgent and nothing was procedural, and he'd learned more in 6 months than in the prior 6 years. He worked alongside Novatech's legal team, cautiously at first, with the wariness of professionals who had just been shown up by an outsider and were not entirely sure how to feel about that. The woman with the silver glasses was named Patricia Voss, and she was a senior partner at the outside firm, and she was exceptional at her job. And for the first 4 days, she was extremely polite to him in the way that people are polite when they are actively resisting the urge not to be. On the 5th day, she sent him a draft of the revised Section 14 language without being asked, with a note that said, "Tell me what I'm missing," and after that, things were easier between them. He kept his head down and did the work. He flagged the Appendix F issue to the tax attorney Victoria brought in from outside. He found a discrepancy in the IP valuation schedule that had to do with how Novatech had categorized certain software modules for territorial licensing purposes, and the correction of that discrepancy saved the company approximately $800,000 in licensing fees over the life of the deal. He found it by accident at 8:40 in the evening on a Thursday, eating a gas station sandwich at the borrowed conference room table because he'd missed dinner and the cafeteria was closed. He called the babysitter, a 20-year-old college student named Jamie, who lived in their building and was reliable and didn't charge extra for late pickups, mostly because Sophie had convinced her that their apartment contained the best selection of board games in the building, which was true. And he told her he'd be another hour and was Sophie okay, and Jamie said Sophie was fine, she was asleep, she'd stayed up reading until 8, and then just went down on her own like a light turning off. He hung up and thought, she does that sometimes, just puts herself to bed. He didn't know when she'd started doing that. It hadn't been on purpose, it had just gradually happened, the way children gradually become more self-sufficient while you're not watching. And it was a good thing. He knew it was a good thing. And it also sat in his chest like something that weighed more than it should. He went back to the IP schedule. Victoria Hayes knew something was wrong before she knew what it was. The particular skill of leadership, the kind that takes years to develop and cannot be taught from the outside, is the ability to sense when the temperature of a room has shifted before you can see evidence of the shift. Victoria had developed that skill over 5 years of running a company that had doubled in size twice in that period, managing personalities and egos and competing agendas in an environment where the pressure was constant and the stakes were real. She knew how to read what wasn't being said. And something wasn't being said. It was subtle. The way certain conversations stopped when she wheeled through a hallway. The extra beat of hesitation before answers in board meetings. Not long enough to be obvious, just long enough to register. The fact that Marcus Webb had, in the last week and a half, stopped raising objections to Ethan's continued presence on the Meridian work, which should have been a relief but felt instead like the quiet of water before it goes under ice. She had Carol pull the internal communication logs on Monday morning. She had authorization to access these. It was part of her executive oversight function, and she exercised it rarely, and only when she had reason to. She went through 2 weeks of email traffic among the senior executive team and found nothing conclusive. Some pointed language about the optics of bringing in an outside contractor at the consulting rate she'd authorized. Some commentary between Webb and the CFO about what one email called the temp situation. Nothing actionable. Nothing that crossed a line. She went back further, and then she found it, buried in the contract negotiation archive from 6 weeks prior, an email chain she hadn't been copied on, between Webb and 2 members of the board. The subject line was anodyne, re Q3 strategic positioning, but the content, when she read through the thread, was not about Q3 positioning at all. It was about the Meridian contract. Specifically, it was about what happened to Novatech's share price if the Meridian deal failed. She read it twice. Then she called her corporate attorney. She did not tell anyone else what she'd found. Not yet. She needed to be certain, and she needed to understand the full shape of what she was looking at before she moved. A wrong step here wasn't just damaging, it was potentially irreversible. She'd spent 5 years building something. She was not going to dismantle it by acting before she understood the complete picture. But she kept watching, and she kept Webb close, in the way you keep something close that you are not yet sure is dangerous. The executive board's discomfort with Ethan had started quietly and gotten louder. James Whitfield, Novatech's chief strategy officer, had been with the company for 11 years. He was 53, with the specific authority of a man who had survived multiple CEO transitions and knew where everybody was buried, metaphorically speaking. He was good at his job in the way that many people are good at their jobs, competently, reliably, without brilliance, which is its own kind of value. And he had spent the last 2 weeks watching a man he'd never heard of identify problems that he and his team had spent months missing and doing it calmly, without apparent ego, which was almost worse than if the man had been arrogant about it. Arrogance was manageable. Quiet competence was threatening in a different way. He's not going to stop at Meridian, Whitfield said. It was Tuesday evening in Webb's office, with the door closed. Present were Whitfield, Webb, and the company's general counsel, a thin, careful man named Howard Park, who chose his words the way you choose steps on uncertain ground. Victoria is already extending his scope. I heard from Carol that she's asked him to review the Kessler licensing portfolio next week. Kessler, Webb said. He said it the way you say a word that means something specific to you and that you don't want to say out loud. Yes, Whitfield said. Howard Park said nothing, which was a kind of statement. The Kessler portfolio was a set of legacy licensing agreements that had been structured 8 years ago under circumstances that were, in Howard Park's carefully chosen legal assessment, not ideal from a current regulatory standpoint. Nobody had looked closely at Kessler in 4 years. The agreements were structured through a subsidiary that had since been dissolved, and the licensing fees had been routed through an intermediary account in a way that had made accounting sense at the time and somewhat less sense now. If Hayes sends him to Kessler, Whitfield said, he's going to find things. What kind of things? Webb asked, even though he knew. He was a man who often asked questions he already knew the answers to, as a way of making sure everyone in the room knew that he was willing to be direct about the problem, even if he wasn't willing to actually be direct. Howard Park cleared his throat. Irregularities, he said, that would require explanation. The three of them sat with that for a moment. He needs to be discredited before that happens, Whitfield said. If we can establish that his involvement in the Meridian negotiation was inappropriate, that he had unauthorized access to confidential materials, that his motives for surfacing that loophole are unclear. We control the narrative before Victoria can make him permanent. She's not going to make him permanent, Webb said. Whitfield looked at him. You've seen her with him. She listens to him the way she doesn't listen to most of us. He let that sit. I'm not interested in what she will or won't do as a prediction. I'm interested in managing what she does. What are you proposing? Webb asked. I'm proposing, Whitfield said carefully, that we document every irregularity in his access to confidential materials from day one. Unauthorized contract review. Outside scope analysis. Consulting activities beyond his original contract terms. We build a file, and if it becomes necessary, we present it to the board as a governance concern. Howard Park said, that's a narrative. It's not evidence of wrongdoing. Evidence is what you make of documentation, Whitfield said, with the particular calm of a man who had navigated corporate environments long enough to believe this fully. Walker accessed confidential materials without authorization on his first day. That's a fact. What we say it means is a different question. No one disagreed. And so, quietly, behind closed doors with the particular precision of experienced professionals who knew exactly which words to use and which to avoid, the file began to take shape. Ethan didn't know about the file. What he knew was that by the end of his second week, the Meridian deal was close, genuinely close. The kind of close where the lawyers were arguing about comma placement rather than substance, which is the best possible kind of argument to be having. He knew that Patricia Voss had stopped being politely resistant and started treating him like a colleague, which was a shift he'd noticed and valued without making a production of. He knew that Victoria had told him, on Wednesday afternoon with the precision and economy of language that characterized everything she said, that she wanted him to look at the Kessler portfolio starting the following Monday. He knew that Marcus Webb had stopped making eye contact with him in the hallways, which was a change from the neutral at best regard Webb had shown him in the first weeks. Webb now looked through him, or past him, with the particular quality of deliberate non-acknowledgement that Ethan had learned over years in competitive professional environments to recognize as something more than rudeness. He filed it away. He had learned not to react to things until he understood what they were. That was a rule he'd developed in his 20s and had never found a reason to abandon. On Friday afternoon, he was packing up the conference room he'd been using, returning borrowed materials, restoring the table to something like its original state, when the door opened and James Whitfield walked in. Whitfield was a man who took up a room without appearing to try, the kind of physical and social presence that communicates authority as a default setting. He looked at Ethan for a moment, then at the papers Ethan was stacking, then back at Ethan. "Good work this week," Whitfield said. "Thank you. The Meridian thing. Good catch." He said it with the warmth of a man who is genuinely trying and not quite achieving warmth. Must have been something, spotting that on day one. I had time to read, Ethan said. Whitfield nodded slowly like he was processing something. He moved to the window, not quite turning his back on Ethan, but nearly. How are you finding it? The company? The work? It's been interesting. Victoria treating you well? She's been straightforward. I appreciate that. Whitfield turned slightly. She's very focused, he said. Can be hard to read sometimes. I've worked with her for 4 years and I still don't always know what she's thinking. He paused. One thing I've learned, she moves fast when she decides something. If she's brought you in on Kessler, she's thinking about a longer engagement. Ethan said nothing. I just want you to know, Whitfield continued, that whatever she tells you about the scope, my team is always available to provide context. Historical context about how certain structures got set up and why. It's easy to look at old paperwork and draw the wrong conclusions without the right context. Ethan stacked the last document. He picked up his bag. He looked at Whitfield with the even expression of a man who understood exactly what had just been said to him and was choosing not to react to it yet. I appreciate that, he said. Good. Whitfield's face relaxed slightly. Good. Good to have you on the team. He left before Ethan did, which was clearly the point. Ethan stood in the empty conference room for a moment after the door closed. He looked at the window, at the city gray and wide below. He thought about the way Whitfield had said historical context. He thought about the way Webb had stopped making eye contact. He thought about Howard Park, whom he had met briefly twice in hallway crossings, and who had both times given him the careful smile of a man performing a function. He thought about Kessler. He hadn't looked at the Kessler portfolio yet. Victoria had given him a summary document, but he hadn't dug into the underlying agreements. He'd been planning to start Monday. He thought now that he might start this weekend instead. He took the train home in the early evening, the city sliding past the window in the fading light, and he thought about what he would make Sophie for dinner and whether the brake work on the car could wait another week, and what James Whitfield had actually been trying to tell him. These things occupied his mind in roughly equal proportion, which was not how he would have ordered his priorities at 32 if you'd asked him at 22. But life had done what it did, and here he was. Sophie met him at the door. She was wearing her school backpack on backwards, which was a thing she did sometimes for reasons she'd never fully explained, and she had what appeared to be marker on her left hand and possibly her cheek. We learned about volcanoes today, she said, before he was entirely through the door. Yeah? Did you know they can be underwater? Like there's volcanoes in the ocean, and they just go off and nobody sees them. I did know that, he said. She looked slightly disappointed that this was not new information for him. Well, she said, regrouping, there's a lot of them, more than on land. You're right about that. She accepted this and moved on. He hung up his coat and listened to her talk about volcanoes and made dinner and cleaned up and put her to bed. And at 9:30, he sat at the kitchen table with the Kessler summary document that Victoria had given him and a second cup of coffee, and he started reading. By 11 o'clock, he had a yellow legal pad with 3 pages of notes and a feeling in his chest that was not yet alarm but was adjacent to it, the feeling of a man who has followed a thread and found it attached to something larger and heavier than he expected, something that had been sitting in a dark room for a long time, undisturbed, gathering weight. He sat back in his chair. The refrigerator rattled in the quiet apartment. Down the hall, Sophie was asleep, one arm thrown across the pillow, the same way she threw it across his chest on the night she climbed into his bed. He looked at his notes. Historical context, Whitfield had said. Ethan picked up his pen and wrote 3 words at the top of the legal pad. Then he closed the folder and went to bed, and he lay in the dark for a while before sleep came, thinking about what it meant when powerful people tried to hand you a story about the past before you'd had a chance to read it yourself. The 3 words he'd written at the top of the legal pad were, "Who benefits how?" It was a framework he'd developed early in his consulting career, borrowed loosely from the kind of forensic financial analysis that his firm had occasionally been hired to do when a client suspected something was wrong but couldn't articulate what. You started not with the documents, but with the question of incentive. Who benefits from this structure existing the way it exists? How do they benefit? And what would they lose if it changed? He spent Saturday morning at the kitchen table while Sophie watched cartoons in the living room, reading through the Kessler summary a second time with that framework in his head, and by noon he had a clearer picture. Not a complete one, The summary was exactly that, a summary, and the underlying agreements were what he needed, but clear enough to understand why Whitfield had stopped by the conference room on Friday afternoon to offer him historical context. The Kessler portfolio was 8 licensing agreements, all structured 6 to 8 years ago, all running through a subsidiary called Vantage IP Solutions that had been dissolved 4 years prior. The licensing fees, substantial, over the life of the agreements, roughly $60 million in aggregate, had been routed through Vantage into an intermediary account at a foreign bank before being consolidated back into Novatech's operating accounts. There were reasons you might structure a licensing arrangement that way. There were also reasons you might not want someone looking too carefully at why you'd structured it that way, particularly if the underlying IP valuations had been set at figures that were difficult to justify at current market rates, and the routing through a foreign intermediary had created certain tax advantages that were, in Howard Park's earlier description, not ideal from a current regulatory standpoint. What the summary didn't tell him, what the summary was specifically and carefully constructed not to tell him, was who had originated the Kessler structure and who had approved it at the board level. He made a note to find that out on Monday. The weekend passed. The way weekends passed when Sophie was home and the weather was unreliable. The farmer's market on Saturday afternoon, Sophie negotiating hard for a bag of cinnamon almonds that she didn't need and he bought anyway, a movie on the couch. Saturday night that she fell asleep during 20 minutes before the end. Sunday morning pancakes with the blueberries she arranged in faces on top of hers before eating them, which was a tradition she'd invented at age 5 and showed no signs of abandoning. He took her to the park on Sunday afternoon and pushed her on the swings while she narrated an elaborate story she was inventing about a submarine crew who discovered a city on the ocean floor, which looped back to the volcanoes she'd learned about on Friday and incorporated several facts she'd looked up independently, because Sophie did that, got interested in something, and then went deeper on her own, quietly, without making a production of it. He watched her on the swings, her dark hair flying back, and thought about how much she looked like Claire, and how much she was entirely herself, and the two things existed in him simultaneously without resolving into anything cleaner than what they were. Sunday night he called his sister in Portland, which he did irregularly and should have done more regularly, and she asked about the new job and he said it was more complicated than he'd expected, and she said that was either very good or very bad, and he said probably both, and she laughed, and they talked for 40 minutes about things that were not the Kessler portfolio or Marcus Webb or what Whitfield had really been trying to tell him, and it was the most genuinely relaxed he'd felt all week. I went to bed at 10 and was at his desk at Novatech by 7:30 Monday morning. The Kessler files were in a physical archive on the 19th floor, not digitized, or rather digitized, but in a format that had required a system upgrade that apparently hadn't happened, so the originals were still in a storage room behind legal in a set of numbered banker's boxes that smelled like the specific combination of old paper and recycled air that Ethan associated with the early years of his firm, when everything was analog and half his job was finding things in boxes exactly like these. He'd gotten access through Victoria's office. Carol had sent the authorization Monday morning before he arrived, which told him Victoria had anticipated he'd need it, which told him other things about how her mind worked. The legal floor administrator, a man named Glenn, who was cheerful in the way of people who have genuinely made peace with their work environment, helped him locate the right boxes and left him with a folding table, a lamp, and a coffee from the floor machine that tasted like the concept of coffee rather than coffee itself, but which Ethan drank anyway because it was what was available. He worked through the morning. The agreements themselves were dense and cross-referenced in the way of documents that had been written by lawyers who were very good at making things difficult to read, which was sometimes a style choice and sometimes a deliberate strategy, and was, in this case, he increasingly suspected, the latter. He built a timeline on paper, physical paper, handwritten, because that was how he'd always worked when he was trying to understand the shape of something, the act of writing forcing a different kind of attention than typing. By 11, he had the timeline and the name he'd been looking for. The Kessler structure had been originated and approved through the board's internal investment committee. The chair of that committee at the time of origination, 6 years ago, had been Marcus Webb, then serving as chief financial officer before his promotion to COO 18 months later. The IP valuations that set the licensing fees, the valuations that were, in the present day, difficult to justify at current market rates, had been certified by an outside valuation firm whose engagement letter, buried in Box 4, had been signed by Webb personally. And the intermediary foreign account through which the routing had passed, Ethan spent 20 minutes cross-referencing the account details against the subsidiary records in Box 6, was at a bank that appeared once more in the Novatech archive, in a different context entirely. A personal loan facility, extended to a private investment entity. The investment entity's name meant nothing to him, but the signatory on the facility documentation was Howard Park, in his personal capacity, which was a different thing from his capacity as general counsel. Ethan sat back on the folding chair which creaked under his weight. He looked at his timeline. He looked at what he'd found. He thought, this is not a question of historical accounting irregularities. This is not something that happened carelessly 6 years ago and was forgotten. Someone structured this deliberately and has been maintaining it deliberately and does not want it examined. The reason Webb had offered Whitfield as an advance man with historical context was not to protect the company's reputation. It was to protect the structure itself, and by extension, the people who benefited from it. I thought about what Victoria had found in the internal email archive. She had mentioned it to him only obliquely, in a brief exchange Tuesday of the previous week, saying only that she was looking at something she needed to be careful about. He hadn't pressed her. He pressed her now, in his mind, reconstructing the conversation, and understood what she'd been telling him without telling him. She already knew something was wrong with Webb. She just didn't know yet what she was looking at. He closed the files carefully. He put the boxes back. He thanked Glenn, who offered him a second concept of coffee that he declined, and he took the elevator to the 24th floor and walked past Carol's desk with a nod and knocked on Victoria's office door. Close the door, she said. He closed it and sat down across from her and put his handwritten timeline on the desk between them. She looked at it. She didn't touch it yet. Tell me, she said. He told her. He took 12 minutes and used plain language and did not editorialize. He laid out the Kessler structure, the valuations, Webb's role in originating it, the intermediary account, and Howard Park's personal connection to the foreign bank. He laid it out in sequence, the way you lay out something you want another person to be able to follow without the benefit of having sat in a storage room with it for 4 hours. When he finished, Victoria was quiet for a moment. She was very still. The specific stillness that Ethan had come to understand was not absence of reaction, but the opposite, was the way she processed things that required the full weight of her attention. Her hands were flat on the desk. Her eyes were on the timeline. Webb has been pushing the Meridian deal toward failure, she said. Not a question, something she was testing aloud. I think so, Ethan said. I can't prove it yet. But the concession points that broke down in the original negotiation, the ones that were still breaking down the morning I read the contract, they follow a pattern. Every time Meridian offered a path forward, the Novatech counterproposal closed it. Not because it was bad strategy, because someone was making sure the door didn't open. Why Meridian specifically? Because if Meridian fails and Novatech's valuation drops, the company becomes acquirable at a price that currently isn't available. And if you look at who holds options on Novatech equity through certain investment vehicles, he paused. I'd need a financial forensics person to trace it definitively, but the shape of it is there. Victoria was quiet again. He waited. He'd learned in the past weeks that she needed a specific kind of space to process, not silence exactly, but uninterrupted time, and people who could give her that without filling it with reassurance or questions. He's been with this company for 9 years, she said finally. I know. He was here before me. He knows every relationship, every partnership, every board member's pressure points. She looked up from the timeline. Her eyes were steady. If I move against him without airtight documentation, he will take the board with him and I will lose the company I spent 5 years building. And he knows that, which is why he's been comfortable. Yes, Ethan said. Can you build the documentation? I need access to the financial records, not the summary documents, the originals, transaction records, the equity option filings, the investment vehicle registry. He paused. And I need to do it quietly, because if Webb knows I'm looking at this, the file Whitfield is building on me becomes a weapon. They'll move first and use the unauthorized contract access from my first day as the trigger. Victoria looked at him. You know about the file? I figured it out. When? Friday, when Whitfield came to talk to me about historical context. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, I should have told you. You were being careful. I should have told you anyway. She said it with the flatness of someone who is not making an excuse, just a correction for the record. I knew they were building something. I didn't know what. I was trying to give you enough rope to work without tying you to a moving target. She looked at the timeline again. I was also, she said, more quietly, not entirely sure I could trust you. That's reasonable, he said. She looked at him sharply, like she'd expected pushback and had braced for it. I was a stranger with unauthorized access to confidential materials, he said. On my first day. Your caution made sense. She looked at him for a moment longer. Something in her expression shifted, not softened exactly, but adjusted, like a lens that had been slightly off and found its focus. I need a week, he said. Maybe 10 days. I need the financial records and I need Patricia Voss because what I'm building is going to need legal weight behind it. I'll get you both. And I need Webb to believe nothing has changed. I need him to think the Kessler Review is slow and uneventful and that I'm just a careful temp doing routine work. Can you do that? He thought about the conference room on the 19th floor and the folding chair and the concept of coffee. I've been doing it since Friday, he said. The next 9 days were the most complicated professional exercise of his life, which was saying something, because his life had contained some genuinely complicated professional exercises. He worked the Kessler Review in the open, visibly, at a pace that communicated thoroughness without urgency. He checked in with Carol once a day, briefly, with status updates that were true in their specifics and misleading in their framing. He was making progress. The agreements were complex. He expected to have a preliminary report by end of week. He said this on Wednesday. He said a version of it again on Friday. Webb's assistant sent him an email Thursday afternoon asking if he needed any additional materials, which Ethan read as a monitoring probe and responded to politely. In parallel, through access that Victoria arranged through a different channel, a financial compliance officer named Ewan, who reported directly to Victoria and whose role existed specifically to bypass the normal chain of command in internal audit situations. Ethan was building the second document, the real one. The transaction records, the equity filings, the option trail that connected Webb's investment vehicle to a series of short positions on Novatech stock that would pay out handsomely if the company's value dropped by 30% or more. Patricia Voss worked with him from Wednesday onward. She was, Ethan discovered, even better than he'd thought. Not just technically excellent, but strategically careful, the kind of lawyer who understood that a case was only as strong as its weakest inference, and who flagged every place where the evidence required interpretation rather than direct reading. She pushed back on 2 of his conclusions, and she was right both times, which he told her, and which she received without the performance of modesty that would have irritated him. Webb isn't going to see this coming, she said on Friday evening, in the small conference room that had become their working space, the city dark outside the windows. He's been watching the Kessler Review. He's not watching us. Not yet, Ethan said. How long do we have? The board meeting is Tuesday. Victoria wants to move at the board meeting. Patricia looked at him. That's tight. Yes. If we go in Tuesday and it's not airtight, it'll be airtight. He said it without bravado, just as a fact he was committed to making true. She looked at him for a moment. You do this a lot? Build cases like this? Not exactly like this, he said, but close enough. What happened to your firm? He looked at the documents in front of him. My wife died, he said. I needed to be somewhere smaller for a while. Patricia didn't say she was sorry either, which was its own kind of respect. She said, I'm glad you landed here, and went back to the documents. Monday came with a phone call at 7:15 in the morning from a number Ethan didn't recognize. He let it go to voicemail. The voicemail was from Howard Park, who had apparently gotten his cell number from somewhere, and who said, in the careful, measured tones of a man who had scripted this call in advance, that he'd like to have a brief informal conversation before the board meeting tomorrow, just to provide some context about the Kessler work and make sure the conclusions being drawn were informed by the full picture. Ethan listened to it twice. He deleted it. He called Victoria. Park called me, he said. I know. He called me at 6:45. Her voice was flat and contained, the tone she used when she was managing something that required all of her control. They know the board meeting is tomorrow and they know something is coming. They don't know what. Are you ready? A pause. Brief, but there. Yes, she said. He got Sophie to school, walked to the train, and spent the commute going over the presentation in his head, not the slides, which Patricia had prepared with the precision of a legal document, but the sequence of arguments, the pressure points, the places where Webb's team would push back and what they would say and what the response needed to be. He ran it through twice and found one gap, a gap in the equity option timeline between month 4 and month 7, where the documentation was inferential rather than direct. And he called Patricia from the platform as the train pulled in and told her, and she said she'd seen it too and had an exhibit that closed it if they used it correctly. Use it correctly, he said. Walker, she said, and he could hear something that was almost amusement under the tension in her voice. I've been using evidence correctly since before you were old enough to read a contract. Fair, he said, and hung up. The emergency board meeting convened at 10 Tuesday morning. Victoria had called it as a special session under her executive authority, the stated purpose being a governance review triggered by the compliance audit. 7 board members were present in person, 2 by video. Webb was in the room, along with Whitfield and Park, all 3 of whom had taken seats along the right side of the table in what Ethan noticed was a specific arrangement, grouped, deliberate, a block. Webb's expression was controlled and confident, the expression of a man who has played this game before and believes he knows how it ends. Ethan sat along the side wall, not at the table. That had been his choice. He was there to present, not to deliberate, and there was a difference that mattered. Victoria opened the meeting without preamble. That was her style. No performative warmth, no procedural softening, just the thing itself. This meeting addresses a governance matter that has come to my attention through the internal compliance review, she said. I want to state clearly, before anything else, that what you're about to hear represents preliminary findings that I believe require board action. After the presentation, we'll hear response. She looked at Webb briefly. Everyone will have an opportunity to speak. Webb nodded, professionally, accommodatingly. He still believed he controlled the outcome. I also want to address a preliminary matter, Victoria continued. An attempt has been made within the last week to build a file against the contractor leading this review in order to discredit his findings before they could be presented. I have documentation of that effort. It will be available to board members on request. She paused. That effort failed. We'll proceed. Webb's expression flickered. Not by much. But Ethan saw it, and Patricia saw it, and 2 of the board members who'd been watching Webb saw it too. Ethan stood up. He walked to the front of the room. He was aware of 12 people watching him and of how much depended on the next 40 minutes, and he set both of those things aside in the specific way he'd trained himself to set things aside when there was work to do, not ignoring them, just moving them to a back shelf where they could wait. Kessler, he said, I want to start with the structure and then we'll go to the intent. He walked them through it, methodically, without theatrics. The agreements, the valuation methodology, the routing arrangement, the intermediary account. He showed them the documents, not summaries, the originals, which Patricia had prepared as exhibits. He used plain language because plain language was harder to argue with than specialized language, which could always be disputed on technical grounds. When he reached the equity option evidence, the room was very quiet. The short positions on Novatech equity, he said, and put the exhibit on the screen, were opened through an investment vehicle called Clearline Capital Partners. The beneficial owner of Clearline, per the registration filing submitted to the state corporate registry, he pulled up the document, is listed as a trust administered by Park Meridian Advisors. He paused. Not the Meridian from the licensing deal, a private advisory firm, registered 4 years ago. The sole officer of Park Meridian Advisors, another document, is Howard Park. Howard Park's face went gray in the specific way of a man watching something he'd spent years maintaining come apart in public. The short positions, Ethan continued, opened 6 months ago, just before the Meridian licensing negotiations entered their final phase. They are structured to pay out at maximum value if Novatech's stock price declines by 30% or more. The Meridian deal, if it had failed, would have triggered exactly that decline, according to the financial modeling prepared by our outside analysts last week. He put up the modeling. Webb said, "This is speculation." "Some of it," Ethan said. "The equity positions are not speculation. Those are public filings." He looked at Webb. What is speculative is whether the positions were established in anticipation of the deal failing because someone was ensuring the deal would fail. That is a question for the board and ultimately for regulators. What I can show you is the what. The why is an inference. He paused. A very well-supported inference. Whitfield said, he had unauthorized access to confidential materials. His findings should not... Mr. Whitfield. It was one of the board members, a woman in her 60s named Ruth Adler, who had been on the board for 8 years and who had the specific authority of someone who has outlasted multiple cycles of corporate drama and is no longer impressed by any of them. We'll address process concerns after we've heard the substance. Please let him finish. Whitfield sat back. Ethan finished. He walked through the timeline, Webb's origination of the Kessler structure, Park's connection to the intermediary account, the pattern of negotiation decisions in the Meridian process that consistently closed rather than opened paths to agreement. He was specific about what was documented and what was inferred. I was clear about where the chain of evidence was solid and where it required regulatory investigation to complete. He did not overstate. That was the discipline that mattered most in a room like this. Not the argument you could make, but the argument you could actually stand behind. When he finished, the room was quiet for a long moment. Ruth Adler said, "Mr. Webb, you have the floor." What followed was 35 minutes of the most uncomfortable professional theater Ethan had ever witnessed. Webb spoke first, measured, authoritative, casting the Kessler structure as a legitimate tax efficiency arrangement made in good faith, characterizing the equity positions as a private investment matter entirely separate from his professional duties, arguing that the Meridian negotiation decisions were a matter of strategic judgment that could be interpreted multiple ways. He was good. Ethan had expected him to be good. I was the kind of man who had been performing this particular kind of confidence for decades. Park said almost nothing, which was the choice of a man whose lawyer had gotten to him between yesterday and this morning. Whitfield tried twice to raise the unauthorized access issue and was redirected twice by Ruth Adler, who was patient about it the first time, and notably less patient the second time. Then Patricia Voss spoke, briefly and with the specific precision of a person who saves the most important thing for last. She addressed the equity position documentation, the corporate registration records, and a single additional document that she and Ethan had been holding back. An email, recovered from the compliance archive between Webb and Park, dated 8 months prior, that referenced the Meridian negotiations by name and used the phrase optimal decline scenario in a context that, in Patricia's careful and measured legal assessment, suggested the two men had discussed the deal's failure as a desired outcome rather than a risk. Webb looked at the email on the screen. His confidence, which had been controlled and maintained and professional right up until that moment, did something complicated and did it visibly, and for just a moment, a second, 2 seconds, something true showed on his face that he couldn't manage back into neutral before several people in the room had seen it. Ruth Adler called a brief recess. The board voted at 2:15 in the afternoon. Webb was suspended pending external investigation. Park was placed on administrative leave. Whitfield, who had not been directly implicated but who had been part of the effort to suppress the review, was asked to voluntarily step back from his executive duties while the board conducted a full governance audit, and he agreed, which was the agreement of a man who understood the alternative. The Meridian contract was scheduled for final signing on Thursday. Ethan sat in the conference room down the hall from the boardroom after it was over, because it had seemed like the right place to go, and he hadn't had a better idea. And Patricia came in and set a bottle of water on the table in front of him and sat down across from him and looked at him for a moment. "You all right?" she said. "I think so. That's about the right level of certainty for today." He almost smiled. "How long does the external investigation take?" "Year. Maybe more. Regulators are involved once we file, which we'll file this week." She looked at the table. "Webb is going to have expensive lawyers." "I know. You may be called as a witness." "I figured. You're okay with that?" He thought about Sophie and her crayons and her volcanoes and the submarine city she was inventing story by story. He thought about the crayon drawing in his breast pocket, the one with the lopsided star. "I'm okay with it," he said. Patricia nodded. She stood up, gathered her materials. At the door, she paused. "Walker," she said, "for what it's worth, you did this right. You could have gone faster and been sloppier and it still would have landed. You didn't. He looked at the table. Sloppier wouldn't have been fair, he said, even to him. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't quite read, and then she left. He sat there another 10 minutes in the quiet room, and the afternoon light came through the window at a low winter angle, and the city below was ordinary and indifferent and going about its business. And somewhere across that city, Sophie was in school learning something she would come home and tell him about tonight in detail, and he thought that was the most solid thing he knew. Victoria found him there. She came in and positioned herself across from him, and for a moment neither of them said anything. She looked tired in a way that was different from the tired he'd seen on her in the first weeks. This was not the exhaustion of crisis management, but something older and heavier. The exhaustion of a person who has spent a long time trusting carefully and discovered that the carefulness was not enough. "Thank you," she said. She said it simply, without decoration. "You're welcome, Seth," he said, equally simply. She looked at the window. 9 years, she said. Webb was here 9 years. I know. I should have seen it. Maybe, he said, but you saw what you needed to see when it mattered. You let me into that room on my first day when nobody else would have. She was quiet. That was the thing that changed everything, he said. Not what I found. The fact that you said let him in. She looked at him. Her eyes were steady and tired and something else. Something that was not quite relief and not quite gratitude, but held both of them. The way a room holds everything that's happened in it long after the people have gone. The Meridian signing is Thursday, she said. I know. I'd like you there. I'll be there, he said. She nodded, once. She started to leave. Then she stopped, one hand on the door, and said without turning around, Your daughter, Sophie. He waited. How old is she? 7, he said. Victoria was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I'd like to meet her sometime, if that's something you'd both be comfortable with. It was such a careful way of phrasing it, not an assumption, not a given, just a possibility offered and left open. He recognized in it the same quality that made her good at what she did. Precision in the places where precision mattered, and enough space for the other person to be whatever they actually were. I think she'd like that, he said. She'll probably tell you about volcanoes. Something crossed Victoria's face. Not a full smile, but something in the neighborhood. I'll be prepared, she said, and left. Ethan sat for another moment in the quiet room, and then he got his bag and his coat, and he went to pick up his daughter from school, arriving 4 minutes late, slightly out of breath, and Sophie looked at him from the school steps with her mother's eyes and said, You're late. And he said, I know, I'm sorry. And she said, It's okay, and took his hand, and they walked to the train together in the cold afternoon air. And she told him about what they'd learned in math, and he listened, and the city moved around them, loud and ordinary, and entirely indifferent to the fact that something had just been decided in a boardroom on the 24th floor of a glass building that would matter to a lot of people for a long time. And Ethan Walker walked through it all with his daughter's hand in his, and felt, for the first time in longer than he could precisely measure, something that was not quite peace but was close enough to recognize. The Meridian signing happened on Thursday at 2 in the afternoon, in the same conference room on the 22nd floor where everything had started 3 weeks earlier. The same long table, the same city visible through the same windows, though the light was different now. Winter afternoon instead of winter morning, the angle lower and more direct, cutting across the table in a way that made the room feel smaller and warmer than Ethan remembered it. The Meridian Global delegation was 4 people, led by a man named Daniel Lim, who was their chief legal officer, compact and precise, and someone who had clearly been in rooms like this many times and knew how to be in them. He shook hands with Victoria first, then with Patricia, then with Ethan, and held Ethan's hand a beat longer than the others. I understand you're the one who found the interpretive framework, Lim said. It was in the contract, Ethan said. I just read it carefully. Lim looked at him with the expression of a man who recognizes understatement when he hears it and appreciates it. We should have found it ourselves, he said. Our team spent 14 weeks on this document. These things happen. They do, Lim said, but they don't usually get fixed by someone who'd been in the building 4 hours. He moved on to greet the other Novatech representatives, and Ethan stood near the window and watched the room fill, and thought about what 14 weeks of failure and one morning of careful reading meant in terms of how the world worked, and didn't come to any useful conclusion. The world worked the way it worked. Sometimes the thing that saved you was luck. Wrong box near the copy room, pages left on the wrong table. And sometimes it was just paying attention. The time it was both at once, and you couldn't separate them. The signing took 23 minutes. The documents were thick, and the signing itself was ceremonial in the way that major agreements always are. Each page initialed, witnesses signing in sequence, the final document photographed for the record. When Daniel Lim signed the last page and set down his pen, there was no dramatic moment. Just the quiet of people in a room who had reached the end of something long and difficult and were not yet sure how to occupy the air that was left. Victoria signed for Novatech. She did it without ceremony, with her characteristic economy of movement, and set the pen down and looked at the document for just a moment. Not long, but Ethan was watching and he saw it, the particular quality of a person confronting a thing they weren't sure they'd get to see. 5 years of building, 3 weeks on the edge, and now this. A signature on a page. Not small, but not what it looked like from the outside either. Afterward, there was a brief reception, drinks, the kind of conversation that happens when two sides of a negotiation finally stop negotiating and have to figure out what to talk about instead. Ethan stood with a glass of water near the credenza and watched and mostly let it happen around him. At some point, Patricia appeared at his elbow. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Like I want to go home," he said honestly. She laughed, which was the first time he'd heard her laugh. And it was genuine and a little surprised, like laughter that came out when she wasn't expecting it. "Me too," she said. "But drink something first. It's impolite to leave before Lim does." He drank his water and waited for Lim to leave, and then he went home. Novatech spent the following 2 months in the complicated aftermath of what the press, when the regulatory filing became public knowledge 6 weeks later, called a corporate governance failure at the executive level. The coverage was thorough and mostly accurate, and generated the specific kind of institutional turbulence that requires constant management, board communications, investor calls, statements carefully worded by the PR team, and an internal town hall that Victoria ran herself, standing in front of 400 employees and answering questions with the directness that was simply how she operated, regardless of whether the questions were comfortable. Ethan was not named publicly in most of the reporting, which was how he preferred it. He was referenced in the regulatory filing as an external consultant whose review had identified the irregularities, but the filing was a dense document, and most journalists who read it moved on to the more narratively satisfying elements of equity manipulation and executive misconduct. His name appeared in 3 articles, none of them prominent. Sophie asked him once if he was famous, and he said no, and she seemed satisfied. His consulting contract had been extended twice by this point, first to cover the governance review period, then to cover a broader operational assessment that Victoria had asked him to lead. The work was real and absorbing, and he was good at it. And he went to the office most days and came home to Sophie most evenings, and the rhythm of it felt sustainable in a way that the previous 3 years had not quite managed to feel. The change happened gradually and then more quickly, the way most changes do when you're not watching for them. It started with a conversation, not a dramatic one. Most of the important conversations in Ethan's experience weren't dramatic at the time, just direct, the weight of them only visible in retrospect. Victoria asked him to stay late one Tuesday in February to review a document she'd been working on. This was not unusual. She often worked late, the executive floor quiet after 7 with just Carol gone for the night and the cleaning crew moving through the hallways below, and Ethan had gotten comfortable with those late evening working sessions in a way that felt different from how he'd felt about the office at the beginning. Less like a place he was visiting and more like a place he knew. The document was not what he'd expected. It was 12 pages, structured as a business concept paper rather than an operational brief. The title was Access First, Technology Solutions for Physical Independence. He read it again. "This is a company," he said. "Yes." "You want to start a new company?" "A subsidiary, initially, possibly independent within 3 years." She was at the window. She often moved there when she was working through something, positioned where the city was visible, which Ethan had come to understand was a kind of thinking posture for her. Novatech has the infrastructure and the capital base to incubate it. The board will require convincing, but that's manageable. He looked at the document again. The concept was clear and the need was genuine. Accessible technology for people with physical disabilities, not adaptations of existing products, which was the standard industry approach, and which was, as the paper argued compellingly, a fundamentally insufficient solution to a fundamentally structural problem: new products, built from the ground up with accessibility as the core design principle rather than an afterthought. Software, hardware, interface design. The paper cited the market gap specifically, and the human cost of the gap even more specifically. It was good. It was not a corporate concept paper written by a committee trying to sound innovative. It was something someone had actually thought about, hard, from the inside. "How long have you been working on this?" he asked. "Pieces of it for 2 years," she said, "but I started writing it down in January." He looked up at her. January was right after the board meeting, right after Webb. She met his eyes briefly and then looked back at the window. "I've spent 5 years making sure Novatech succeeded," she said, "which was the right priority, and I don't regret it. But it was also," she paused, choosing the word carefully, "a narrow focus. Success as a specific measurable thing: revenue, market position, deal value." She looked at the document. "I've been in a wheelchair since I was 22. I know what it costs when technology doesn't account for how you actually move through the world. I've known it for 8 years. And I've been running a technology company for 5 of those years, and I haven't done anything about it." He said nothing. He understood she wasn't asking for absolution or reassurance. She was explaining, which was different. "I want to do something about it," she said, "and I want to do it correctly, which means I need someone who understands how to build a company from the operations side." She looked at him. "I'm asking you to be my partner in this, not a consultant, a partner." The word sat in the air between them. Ethan set the document down on the table. He looked at it, 12 pages of something real that someone had cared about enough to write carefully. He thought about his own firm, the one he'd built at 26, the 40 people and the real work and the feeling of something that mattered being made out of nothing. He thought about the smaller life he'd chosen 3 years ago when that version of himself stopped being available to him. He thought about Sophie's crayon drawing with the lopsided star. "I need to think about it," he said. She nodded. "I know." "Same as before, tomorrow morning." A flicker of something, not quite amusement, but close to it. "I'll be here," she said. He thought about it on the train home. He thought about it while he made dinner, and while Sophie told him about a book she was reading about a girl who discovered she could talk to birds. Not literally, Sophie clarified, but in the way where you understood what they were saying without words, which Sophie thought was more realistic than the literal version, and had a theory about why. He listened and thought and nodded at the right moments, and Sophie, who was perceptive in ways she probably didn't fully understand yet, looked at him once during dinner and said, "You're doing the faraway thing." "Sorry," he said. "It's okay. Is it about work?" "Sort of." She considered this. "Is it a good far away or a bad far away?" He looked at her across the table. "I think it's a good one," he said. She nodded and went back to her dinner and her bird theory, and he came back from wherever he'd been and listened to her, and by the time the dishes were done, he'd made his decision, though he didn't call it a decision yet. He called it a direction, which was the honest name for something you know you're going to do but haven't committed to out loud. He called Victoria at 9:30. She answered on the second ring, which told him she'd been waiting. "Yes," he said. A pause. Brief. "Okay," she said. "I have conditions." "Tell me." "I want operational authority over the company structure. Not advisory. Actual decision-making authority for the build-out. You lead the vision and the external relationships. I build the machine that executes it." Agreed. "The equity structure needs to be clean from day one. No complicated vehicles, no routing arrangements. Transparent." "Obviously," she said, and there was a dryness in her voice that made him realize she was making a reference to Webb, and it was a dark joke, and he appreciated it. "And I want a flexible schedule for the first 6 months. Sophie is in 2nd grade and she has things, events, stuff I don't want to miss." He paused. "I've missed enough already." There was a silence on the other end that was different from her processing silences. Warmer. He couldn't see her face, but something in the quality of the pause told him she was looking at something, not the city, something closer. "Agreed," she said. Okay then, he said. Okay, she said. He hung up and stood in the kitchen in the quiet apartment, and the refrigerator rattled and down the hall. Sophie was asleep, and the city was doing what cities do at 9:30 on a Tuesday night, which is everything and nothing simultaneously. And Ethan Walker stood there for a moment with his hand still on his phone and felt the specific sensation of a door opening that he'd spent 3 years keeping shut. And it was frightening, and it was also, underneath the fright, something that felt like being alive in the direction of something real. Victoria met Sophie for the first time on a Saturday in early March, which was partly accidental and mostly not. Ethan had come in on a Saturday to finalize the Access First concept paper for the board presentation. It needed a complete operations section, and he'd been putting it off during the week because there was always something more urgent, which was a pattern he recognized as a problem and was addressing. Victoria was already there when he arrived, which surprised neither of them because they'd both stopped being surprised that the other was in the office on weekends. He'd brought Sophie because Jamie had a family thing, and Mrs. Delgado was visiting her son in Philadelphia, and his sister was in Portland, and the choice was bring Sophie or don't come in, and the operations section wasn't going to write itself. Sophie walked into the executive floor with the particular self-possession of a 7-year-old who has been in enough adult spaces to know that the way you handle an adult space is to act like it's normal, which she did, looking around with interest but not with the performed awe that adults sometimes expected from children in impressive places. She looked at the art on the walls, which was abstract and colorful, and said, "That one looks like a storm," pointing at a large canvas near the elevator, and then turned to Ethan and said, "Is there somewhere I can draw?" Carol wasn't in, but the conference table down the hall had space, and Ethan had packed her backpack with her sketchbook and colored pencils and a book in case she finished drawing, and he got her settled and went to find Victoria. He didn't need to find Victoria. Victoria came to him, or rather came down the hall to the conference room, presumably because she'd heard voices and had the reasonable executive instinct of knowing who was in her building. She appeared in the doorway and stopped, and Sophie looked up from her sketchbook and looked at Victoria with the frank assessment that children apply to new people, which is more thorough and less polite than what adults do. "Hi," Sophie said. "Hi," Victoria said. "I'm Sophie. I'm drawing a storm." She turned the sketchbook to show a dense swirl of blue and gray pencil lines that did, in fact, look like a storm. "It's based on that painting in the hall." Victoria looked at the drawing. "That's good," she said. "You caught the movement." Sophie studied her. "How do you know about movement in drawings?" "I took art classes when I was younger." "Did you like them?" "Some of them, the ones where they let you draw what you actually saw instead of what they told you to see." Sophie considered this with the seriousness she brought to things that interested her. "That's what I do," she said. "Draw what I actually see." She looked at Victoria's wheelchair with the same frank attention she'd given everything else. "Does that go fast?" Victoria glanced at Ethan, who was standing in the doorway having decided that the best thing he could do was nothing. "Faster than you'd think," Victoria said. "Can I see?" "Sophie," Ethan started. "It's all right," Victoria said. She moved the wheelchair forward a few feet and then back. Not fast, but with the easy control of someone who has spent 8 years learning how their body works in this configuration and has stopped thinking about it as a limitation and started thinking about it as just the way things are. Sophie watched with attention, not pity, the same attention she'd give anything that moved interestingly, which was the same attention she gave birds in the park, and the train arriving at the platform, and her father's hands when he was cooking. "Cool," she said, and went back to her drawing. Victoria looked at Ethan. He looked at her. Something passed between them that was not a conversation but contained more than a conversation would have. "The operations section," Victoria said. "Down the hall," he said. She went ahead of him, and he told Sophie he'd be nearby, and Sophie said okay without looking up. And for the next 2 hours, the executive floor had, for what Carol would later say was the first time in the 5 years she'd been working there, the sound of a child humming to herself while she drew, which was not a loud sound or a dramatic sound, but which filled the space in a way that was different from how the space was usually filled, in a way that was, Carol would struggle to describe this, lighter somehow. More like a place where people actually were, rather than a place where work happened. The Access First board presentation was in April, and it was approved, and the work of building it began. The building was slow in the places where building is always slow. legal structure, initial capitalization, hiring the first technical team, finding office space that met the accessibility standards that Victoria had specified, and that turned out to be harder to find than either of them had anticipated, which was itself evidence of the problem they were trying to solve. Ethan spent 2 weeks on lease negotiations for a building in the tech district, during which he was reminded of things he'd forgotten about what it felt like to build something from nothing, which is that it is mostly not exciting. It is mostly phone calls and document reviews and conversations that go in circles before they go anywhere useful. But there were moments that weren't like that. The first hire was a software engineer named Rosa Chen, who had been born with a condition affecting her left hand and who had spent 15 years working in accessibility technology and who interviewed with Victoria and Ethan in a conference room and spent the first 10 minutes of the interview telling them everything that was wrong with the current state of accessibility tech in terms that were specific and unsparing and clearly came from someone who had lived inside the problem. Most companies treat accessibility as compliance, Rosa said. They build to the minimum standard because that's all they're required to do. You pass the audit and you move on. The people using the product, she paused. You lose track of the people using the product. We won't do that, Victoria said. Rosa looked at her, not skeptically, but with the careful assessment of someone who has heard this kind of statement before from people who meant it at the time and then got busy. How will you make sure you don't? Victoria said. By hiring people for whom it's not abstract. Rosa looked at her for another moment. Okay, she said. I'm in. The second hire was a hardware designer named Marcus Thibodeau. No relation to Webb, a fact that Ethan confirmed with himself privately and with a humor he kept internal, who had designed adaptive interface devices for medical equipment companies, and who had opinions about everything and expressed them constantly, and was exactly the kind of person that a new company building something genuinely new needs, and that established companies almost never hire because the opinions make meetings difficult. Ethan hired him after a 90-minute conversation that felt more like an argument and that left him energized in the way that good arguments sometimes do. By June, Access First had 7 employees, 2 product development tracks underway, a technical advisory board that Patricia Voss had helped assemble with her characteristic precision, and a working prototype of an adaptive interface system that Rosa and Marcus had built together in a way that suggested they had developed a collaborative rhythm, despite, or possibly because of, the fact that they argued about almost everything. The prototype was demonstrated for the first time in the Access First development space, a converted floor of the Novatech building, open plan, every workstation designed for full accessibility, on a Tuesday afternoon in late June. Victoria sat at the interface station, and Rosa walked her through the adaptive system, which adjusted in real time to her specific movement patterns and integrated with her existing assistive technology in a way that current market solutions didn't manage. It took her 12 minutes to learn it and another 8 to do something with it that she hadn't been able to do before. A specific documentation task that her standard setup made difficult in ways she'd learned to work around rather than solve. When she finished, the room was quiet. How long to get this to market? She asked. 18 months if we're careful, Rosa said. 12 if we're lucky. We'll be careful and lucky, Victoria said. Rosa looked like she wanted to argue with this and then decided it was actually acceptable. Fine, she said. The thing about building something alongside a person is that you learn them differently than any other way. You learn how they handle the things that don't work, which is more revealing than how they handle the things that do. You learn their blind spots, not from what they say, but from what they consistently don't see until someone else points at it. You learn what they care about enough to fight for and what they'll let go of, and that line is different for everyone and says more than almost anything else. Ethan learned that Victoria could hold an extraordinary amount of complexity in her head simultaneously, but sometimes lost track of the human variable, the engineer who was burning out, the investor relationship that needed tending, the moment when a team needed to hear that the work mattered before they could hear the next list of problems. He started quietly covering those moments, not because she couldn't learn them, but because he was faster at it, and she had other things to do, and she noticed and was grateful without making it into something, which he appreciated. Victoria learned that Ethan was allergic to anything that felt like performance, performative optimism, performative leadership, the kind of culture-building language that startups used to substitute for actual clarity. He would shut it down in meetings with a flatness that could seem harsh, until you understood that what he was actually doing was protecting the team from building on false premises, which was a kindness even when it didn't feel like one. She started flagging for him in advance when a meeting was going to need some of that energy, which gave him time to find a version of it he could live with. They disagreed about the product pricing strategy in July, seriously enough that they spent 2 days not talking about it and working around it, which was uncomfortable for everyone who shared their workspace. Rosa asked Ethan privately if everything was okay, and he said yes, it's just a disagreement, and Rosa said she knew that, but it was affecting the room, and he said he'd work faster. He and Victoria resolved it on a Wednesday evening in her office, working through the numbers until they found a pricing structure that addressed her concern about accessibility for lower-income users and his concern about financial sustainability. Neither of them fully satisfied, but both of them able to commit, which was the only honest resolution available. "You're not easy to work with," she said when they'd finished. "Neither are you," he said. She looked at him. The late light was coming through the glass wall, and the city was doing its evening thing below them, and she looked tired in the way she looked when she'd been working hard on something that mattered, and was just on the other side of it. "No," she said. "Neither am I." And something in the way she said it, without apology or performance, just the plain fact of it acknowledged between them, was one of those small moments that you don't mark as significant at the time and only understand later was where something changed. Sophie had started coming to the office with Ethan on occasional Saturday mornings with more regularity through the summer because Jamie's schedule had changed, and because Sophie, when offered the alternative of staying with a different neighbor or coming to the office, consistently chose the office with the pragmatic logic of someone who had calculated that the office had better drawing paper and also Victoria. The friendship between them had developed in the unhurried, slightly surprising way that friendships between adults and children sometimes develop when neither party is trying to force it, incrementally, through shared specifics rather than general warmth. Victoria had shown Sophie the view from the 24th floor in all 4 seasons, which Sophie was systematically documenting in a sketchbook she'd dedicated entirely to this purpose. Victoria had introduced Sophie to the concept of tensegrity after Sophie asked why one of the abstract sculptures in the lobby stayed standing, and Sophie had spent a weekend building tensegrity structures out of chopsticks and rubber bands and brought the results to show Victoria the following Saturday with the thoroughness of a report. Victoria, for her part, had given Sophie a book about deep-sea organisms in August. In the oblique and considered way she gave things, just left it on the conference table where Sophie usually drew, with a post-it that said "For your submarine city," which was a reference to the story Sophie had been telling Ethan the previous winter, and which Victoria had apparently been told about and retained. Sophie had read the book cover to cover in 4 days and arrived the following Saturday with 12 pages of notes and questions that she and Victoria spent 45 minutes working through while Ethan sat in the adjacent conference room, pretending to review a document he was not reviewing. He listened through the glass partition to his daughter asking questions and Victoria answering them, sometimes fully, sometimes with, "I don't know. No, let's find out," which Sophie particularly respected in adults, because most adults, in her experience, just made something up. And he felt something that was not one feeling but several at once, which was becoming the characteristic state of things. Victoria's physical therapy had been a constant through all of it, 3 times a week. A therapist named Adrian who came to the office because Victoria's schedule didn't reliably allow for travel to a clinic. The goals were not dramatic: increased range of motion, reduced pain management, the slow and unglamorous work of maintaining what function existed, and, where possible, extending it. Progress came in small increments over long timelines. In June, she had a better week, and in July, she had a worse month, and the worse month didn't undo the better week, but it was hard to remember that while it was happening. Ethan didn't ask about it, and she didn't explain it unless she chose to. What he did was what he did with anything in his life that was real and ongoing. He noticed it and adjusted around it without making it a subject, without the patronizing attentiveness that she'd had from people her whole adult life. The checking in and the concerned looks and the careful offers of help that were more about the helper's comfort than the helped person's need. One afternoon in September, she completed a physical task, transferring from her wheelchair to a standard chair at the conference table, something Adrian had been working toward for 2 months, and held it together fine until Adrian had packed up and left, and then sat at the conference table and was very still for a moment in a way that Ethan recognized from a distance as someone at the edge of something. He brought her a cup of coffee and set it on the table and sat down across from her with his own and didn't say anything. She looked at the coffee. She picked it up. She looked at the window. After a while, she said, 8 years. He didn't ask what she meant. He knew what she meant. You don't have to say anything, she said. I know, he said. They sat there with their coffee while the city did what it did outside the glass, and the building was quiet around them with the specific quality of a place where people have been working hard and gone home, and it was not a comfortable silence or an uncomfortable one, but just a silence between two people who had learned how to be in the same room with the real things. The regulatory investigation concluded in November, 14 months after the board meeting that had ended Webb's career at Novatech. The findings were what Ethan and Patricia had built toward: securities fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and a pattern of deliberate deal sabotage documented with the kind of specificity that left very little room for the expensive lawyers to work in. Webb's legal team had spent those 14 months attempting to reframe the equity positions as unrelated private investment activity, which was a coherent argument in the way that arguments built on technically true statements can be coherent, and which ultimately failed because the email with the phrase optimal decline scenario was the kind of document that coherent arguments cannot survive. Webb received a substantial fine and a permanent bar from serving as an officer or director of any publicly traded company. Howard Park, whose cooperation with investigators had been, in the careful language of the settlement agreement, more forthcoming than Webb's, received a lesser penalty and the end of his legal career in corporate work. Whitfield had resigned in February of the previous year and was not charged, though the board's governance audit had been pointed enough in its conclusions about his role that his departure from the industry was, as far as Ethan could tell, complete. Patricia called Ethan when the finding was announced at 7:40 in the morning before he'd gotten Sophie to school. "It's done," she said. "I saw," he said. He'd read the regulatory announcement on his phone in the kitchen while the coffee brewed. "How do you feel?" He thought about it honestly, which was the only way he knew how to answer questions like that. "Relieved," he said, "and tired in a retrospective way. Like now I can be tired about it." "That's normal," she said. "It's over, Walker. The right thing happened." "Yeah," he said. "Go get your kid to school." He did. What? The Access First headquarters opened in January, a year and 4 months after Victoria had set the 12-page concept paper on the table between them and asked him to be her partner in it. The building was 3 floors of a converted warehouse in the tech district that had been substantially rebuilt from the inside out. Every element of the space designed for full physical accessibility, not as a compliance exercise, but as a foundational principle, which meant it had taken longer and cost more than a standard build-out. And was also, Ethan thought when he walked through it the week before opening, one of the most thoughtfully designed workspaces he'd ever been in. The workstations adjusted. The doorways were wide and the floors were level throughout, and the lighting was adjustable from every position in the room. The meeting spaces had been designed with sight lines that worked for people at different heights, which sounds simple and is not. The bathrooms were functional for everyone rather than having one accessible stall tucked at the back as an afterthought. None of it was dramatic. All of it was the result of Rosa and Marcus arguing productively for 18 months about what it actually meant to build a space that worked, which was a longer argument than it should have been, but which produced something real. They had 22 employees by opening day. The first product, the adaptive interface system that Rosa had demonstrated to Victoria in the development space the previous June, was in its final pre-launch phase, already approved by the Technical Advisory Board and in review with the accessibility certification bodies that would need to sign off before market release. The timeline was March, which was aggressive, and which Rosa had described as achievable if everything went right, and Marcus had described as achievable if everyone worked very hard, and which Ethan had described to the board as achievable if they funded it adequately, which they had. The opening event was a Thursday evening. Victoria had kept it small by the standards of corporate events, 80 people, invitation only, a mix of the Access First team, Novatech board members, investors, and a group of 30 people who used assistive technology in their daily lives and who had been involved in the product development process as user consultants from the beginning. That last group was Victoria's specific insistence. Rosa had suggested it originally, and Victoria had made it non-negotiable, which was the right call, and which had shaped the product in ways that no amount of internal testing would have produced. Ethan arrived at 5:30 with Sophie, who was 8 now, and who had dressed herself for the occasion in a blue dress and her most serious cardigan, and had her sketchbook in her bag because she'd decided she wanted to draw the building from the inside, documenting it the way she'd documented the view from the 24th floor through all 4 seasons. The space filled by 6. Ethan stood near the door for the first part of the evening, talking to people he knew from the development process, and a few investors he'd met during the funding rounds, keeping half his attention on Sophie, who was moving through the room with the self-possession she'd developed in adult spaces, and who had settled eventually near one of the user consultants, a man in his 50s named Gerald, who used a power wheelchair, and who had tested an early version of the adaptive interface, and who had apparently struck up a conversation with Sophie about something that had them both very engaged over by the window. He watched them from across the room. Gerald was showing Sophie something on his phone, probably the interface, Ethan thought, or something related to it. And Sophie was asking questions with the focused attention she brought to things that genuinely interested her. Gerald was laughing at something she'd said. It was such an ordinary moment, 2 people talking by a window at a party, and it sat in Ethan's chest as something that was not ordinary at all. Victoria found him there, watching. "Gerald is explaining the haptic feedback system to her," Victoria said. She asked him why the vibration patterns were different for different alerts. Was she right that they were? She'd used the demo unit for about 4 minutes before she noticed. She paused. "Gerald told me afterward that most adult testers took 20 minutes. Ethan looked at his daughter, who was now drawing something in her sketchbook while Gerald watched. "She notices things," he said. "She does," Victoria said, and then, after a moment, "She gets that from you." He looked at her. She was looking at Sophie, not at him, and her expression was the kind of expression that people have when they are looking at something they have not let themselves look at directly before, and are now looking at it and finding that it is what they thought it was. He didn't say anything. He'd learned that with Victoria, the right response to a moment like this was not to fill it. They stood there for a while as the room moved around them, and at some point Sophie looked up and found them both watching her and gave them the slightly suspicious look of a child who suspects she is being discussed, and then went back to her drawing. The formal part of the evening was brief by design. Victoria spoke for 12 minutes, which was longer than she usually spoke at events, but was, Ethan thought, exactly the right length for what she said. She didn't talk about Novatech's revenue figures or Access First's projected market share. She didn't use the word disruptive, which was notable given the setting. She talked about a specific Tuesday morning 3 years ago when she had arrived at her building for a board meeting and the accessible entrance had been locked, and she had sat in the cold for 11 minutes waiting for someone to find the key, and the board meeting had started without her. And when she arrived, the agenda was already moving and nobody had thought to pause it. She talked about this without drama, just as a thing that had happened, and then she said that 11 minutes was a small thing and that the work Access First was doing was addressed to all the 11-minute things, all the places where the world had been built by people who assumed a certain kind of body moving through it, and had not questioned the assumption because they didn't have to, and that changing those places was not charity, and it was not goodwill, and it was just accuracy, making things that actually reflected the full range of people who needed to use them. The room was quiet in the way rooms get quiet when someone has said something true in public without dressing it up. Then she said, "I want to thank my partner in building this, Ethan Walker, who walked into my company as a temporary contractor, and managed to make himself permanently indispensable through the simple method of being exceptionally good at his job and completely honest about everything else." A pause. Those two qualities are rarer together than they should be. There was laughter, warm and genuine, and Ethan looked at the floor briefly in the way of a man who is not comfortable being thanked publicly and is managing it. Sophie, from across the room, gave him a thumbs up. He gave her a thumbs up back. By 9, the crowd had thinned to the core of people who stay at events past the formal portion. The team, mostly, the people who had actually built the thing, and who were not ready to stop being in the same room with it yet. Rosa and Marcus were in the corner arguing about something that sounded like the next product development cycle, and was probably also about something else entirely, in the way of people who have learned to argue productively and now do it as a mode of communication. Gerald had exchanged contact information with Sophie and promised to send her links to research about haptic feedback systems in marine navigation, which had come up in their conversation in a way Ethan hadn't asked about and didn't need to. Sophie fell asleep on a couch in the small lounge area off the main floor at 9:15, which Ethan had anticipated and prepared for. He'd brought a blanket in his bag, which Sophie had noticed and rolled her eyes at in the car, but which she was now demonstrably using. He draped it over her and looked at her for a moment in the dim quiet of the lounge, and then went back out to the main floor. Victoria was at the window. The building was in the tech district, and the view from this floor was not the 24th floor view. No sweep of the whole city, just the neighborhood, the other buildings, the street below with its late evening traffic, and the lit windows of the restaurant across the street, and the cold January dark between them. A smaller view, not less true. He came to stand beside her, not quite at the window, a few feet back. "Good evening," he said. "Yes," she said. The word had the quality of something considered. It was. "Rosa's already arguing about the next product. I know, I told her to wait until February. She agreed? She said she'd wait until the end of January." He almost smiled. Outside, a cab moved slowly down the street below, its light on, looking for a fare. The restaurant across the way had a table of people visible through the window, 4 of them, clearly celebrating something. A birthday maybe, or just a Thursday that had gone well enough to mark. "I've been thinking about something," Victoria said. He waited. "The investigation is done," she said. "Access First is open. The Meridian deal has been running for over a year without issues." She looked at the street below. "All the things that were unresolved are resolved, which means—" She stopped. "Which means what?" he said. "Which means I've been afraid to think about what comes next," she said. "Because for the last year there was always the next crisis, the next problem, the next thing to build. And I am—" Another pause, shorter, like she was pushing through something rather than stopping at it. "I am not good at the absence of problems. I'm better at the problems." "I know," he said. "It's not an attractive quality." "I didn't say that." She looked at him, not quickly, not as a glance. She turned and looked at him directly in the way she did things directly, which was all the way or not at all. The room behind them had the sounds of the remaining people, the team's conversation, a burst of Rosa's laughter about something, the ambient noise of a building with people in it who are glad to be there. In the lounge off the main floor, Sophie was asleep under a blanket with a sketchbook on the cushion beside her. "I'm not good at this either," Victoria said. He understood what this meant. He stood with it for a moment. "Neither am I," he said. She kept looking at him. "Claire," she said. Not a question, just the name, placed carefully. "Yes," he said. "I'm not trying to—" She stopped. Started again. "I know I'm not— Victoria." He said it the way you say someone's name when you want them to stop constructing the sentence and just say the thing. "I know what you're not. I know what this is and what it isn't. I've been paying attention." She was quiet. "So have I," she said. The cab on the street below found its fare. Someone coming out of the restaurant, hand raised, the small transaction of a city at night going about its ordinary business. The table in the restaurant was still celebrating. The cold was on the glass, and the city was lit up in the way cities are lit up when you see them from inside somewhere warm, which makes the outside look almost deliberate, like someone arranged it. "Sophie asked me something last week," he said. Victoria waited. "She asked if you were going to be around forever or just for a while." He looked at the window. "She said she needed to know because she was making a plan." "What kind of plan?" "She didn't specify, but she had a sketchbook open when she said it. I think it involved drawing." Victoria looked at the street. Something moved across her face. Not controlled this time, not managed, just something true finding its way to the surface because the pressure had been there long enough and the room was quiet enough. "What did you tell her?" she said. "I told her I didn't know," he said, "and that I'd try to find out." She turned back to look at him. Her eyes were steady and tired and something that he had no clean word for, something that was partly the person she'd been before 8 years of learning to carry things alone, and partly the person those 8 years had made her, both of them present at the same time, neither of them canceled by the other. "I'd like to be around for a while," she said. If you're asking." "I'm asking," he said. She nodded. Once, slow, the way she did things when they mattered. "Then yes," she said. They stood at the window for a while longer. At some point Rosa said goodnight, and Marcus said goodnight, and the last of the team filtered out with the particular warmth of people ending an evening that had been genuinely good. The building got quiet. Gerald had left an hour before, with a handshake for Ethan and a wave toward the lounge where Sophie was sleeping. At 10:30, Ethan went to the lounge and woke Sophie, who came awake with the specific disorientation of a child waking in an unfamiliar place, and then oriented herself quickly, looking around, finding the information she needed. "Are we going home?" she said. "In a few minutes." She sat up and reached for her sketchbook and looked at what she'd drawn earlier. The building interior, detailed and careful, the high ceiling and the wide doorways and the window where she'd sat with Gerald. She looked at it with the assessment of someone who is deciding whether it's finished or not. "I want to add something," she said. "Okay." She drew for 5 minutes while he sat beside her. When she finished, she turned the sketchbook to show him. She'd added 2 figures to the drawing, one in a wheelchair near the window and one standing beside her, and the proportions were Sophie's proportions. The slightly oversized heads, and the earnest posture of her stick figures. But there was something in the positioning that was accurate in a different way than proportions, something about the 2 figures facing the same direction and the space between them that was small enough to be deliberate. "Good," he said. She looked at the drawing for another moment. Then she said without looking up, "Is Victoria coming home with us?" "Not tonight," he said. Sophie processed this with the practicality of a child who has learned to take information as it comes. "But another night?" He thought about the window and the street below, and the 2 words she'd said that meant more than they said. "Yeah," he said, "another night." Sophie nodded, satisfied, and closed the sketchbook. She stood up and folded the blanket into the approximate rectangle of someone who is trying to be helpful and doesn't quite have the geometry yet, and Ethan finished folding it and put it in his bag, and they went to find Victoria to say goodnight. March came, and the adaptive interface launched, and the coverage was thorough and mostly accurate and, in several cases, genuinely engaged with what the product actually was, rather than what the press release said it was, which was the best you could ask for. The user response in the first 2 weeks was what Rosa described, with the flat effect of a person trying not to be visibly emotional as better than the model had projected. What she meant was that people were writing in, not just reviews, letters, some of them, actual emails that were longer than reviews need to be, from people who had been using the product for a week or 2 and who wanted to describe specifically what it had changed. Victoria read every one. She read them in the morning before the day started, and she did not share them or discuss them publicly, but Ethan sometimes arrived at the office early enough to see the expression on her face when she was reading them, which was the expression of a person receiving information they had worked very hard for and had not been certain they would receive. He didn't say anything about it. He didn't need to. What he thought about, watching her, was something he'd been turning over for a long time without finding a way to articulate that satisfied him. It had to do with the question of what it cost to start over. Not the practical cost, the money, the time, the professional risk, but the internal cost, the cost of opening something back up that you had closed because keeping it closed felt safer, more manageable, more survivable. He had paid that cost when he'd taken the consulting contract. He had paid it again when he'd said yes to Access First. I was paying a version of it now, in the ongoing daily work of being present to someone else's life and letting someone else be present to his, which was harder in some ways than the professional rebuilding, because the professional rebuilding had stakes. He understood, and this had stakes he could not fully calculate in advance. The thing he'd concluded, imperfectly and without certainty, was that the cost was real and the cost was worth it, but that you had to know going in that the cost was real. The people who told you it was easy, that love or purpose or rebuilding was simply a matter of choosing to begin, those people were either lucky or lying, and either way they weren't describing something useful. What was true in his experience was that the beginning was hard, and the middle was hard in different ways, and the thing that made it survivable was not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of someone who understood that you were in the difficulty together and was not going to pretend otherwise. Victoria understood that. It was maybe the thing about her that had mattered first and mattered most, the refusal to pretend. It had looked like hardness initially, and it was hardness in a sense, but it was the kind of hardness that came from having decided that honesty was worth more than comfort, which was a decision he respected because he'd made it himself at significant cost. Sophie understood it too, in the instinctive way children understand things before they have the language to frame them. She knew that Victoria didn't tell her she was wonderful and talented in the reflexive way adults often talk to children, and that the moments when Victoria did say something specific and positive, that's accurate, about a drawing, or that's a good question, about something she'd asked, those moments were worth paying attention to because they were real. Sophie paid attention to what was real. It was her best quality and sometimes her most exhausting one. What Ethan thought, watching his daughter navigate her life with the pragmatic resilience of someone who had lost her mother at 4 and learned early that the ground could shift and had decided anyway to keep building on it, was that she was going to be fine. More than fine. She was going to be the kind of person who knew how to be in difficulty without being undone by it, which was the most useful thing he could think of to be. He didn't know when he'd stopped worrying about her the way he'd worried in the first years after Claire, that constant low-grade monitoring of whether she was okay, whether the loss had cost her something that couldn't be recovered. She was okay. She had always been more okay than he'd given her credit for, because she was herself and not a reflection of what he feared. He thought, that's what you learn when you stop looking at the people you love through the lens of what might hurt them and start looking at who they actually are. The Access First annual review in April produced numbers that made the board quiet, in the way boards go quiet when the numbers are better than they were prepared for. Rosa presented the user metrics with the flatness she brought to all presentations. No performance, just information. And the information was that 38,000 people were using the adaptive interface system, that the satisfaction scores were among the highest recorded for any assistive technology product in the category, and that 2 hospital networks had reached out about institutional licensing agreements, which was a market channel they hadn't initially planned for, and which represented a significant expansion of reach if handled correctly. Ethan presented the financial model. The company was not yet profitable. That was 2 years out at minimum, and he said so plainly because the board needed to know that in order to plan around it rather than be surprised by it. But the trajectory was solid, and the product market fit was real, which was the thing that was hard to engineer and which they had. The board approved the expansion budget. Ruth Adler, who had been on the Novatech board through the governance crisis and had stayed on the Access First advisory board since, stopped Ethan in the hallway afterward. I want to say something, she said. All right, he said. When Victoria brought you in, after the Meridian business, I was skeptical. She said it without apology, just as fact. I've been on boards for 25 years and I've seen people like you before, smart, outside, come in and shake things up, and then the dust settles and they're either gone or they've become part of the problem. I was waiting to see which. He waited. You're neither, she said. You just built something. She paused. That's harder than it sounds. I know, he said. She looked at him for a moment with the evaluating attention of a person who has been watching carefully and has reached a conclusion. She trusts you, she said. Victoria. She doesn't trust people easily, and she trusts you. I want you to know that I see that, and I think it matters. He didn't know exactly what to do with that, so he said thank you, which was the true thing. Ruth nodded and went to her next meeting. The evening Ethan had not planned for happened on a Tuesday in May, in the kitchen of the apartment that was still the same apartment he'd had for 4 years, still slightly too hot, still with the rattling refrigerator that he'd now actually fixed in February, though it had immediately developed a different, quieter rattle that he'd decided to accept as the new normal. Victoria had been there for dinner. This had become a thing that happened 2 or 3 times a week, with the gradual organic normalcy of things that happen often enough to stop requiring explanation. Sophie had made her case for pasta with the butter and parmesan configuration that was her preferred version and had been outvoted by the adults in favor of something with vegetables, and had accepted this with the dignity of someone who has lost a democratic process and is choosing to honor it. After dinner, Sophie had done her homework at the kitchen table and then taken her sketchbook and retired to the living room couch, which was her thinking space, where she was presumably drawing or reading or inventing the next chapter of the Submarine City story, which had grown over the past year into something with a complicated political structure and 2 main characters and a geography. Sophie had mapped in detail in a separate notebook. The kitchen was quiet with the noise of Sophie in the next room. Ethan was washing the dishes. Victoria was at the kitchen table, going through something on her laptop, which was what she often did in the kitchen in the evening when dinner was done. Not frantically, just the continuation of thoughts that didn't stop because the formal part of the workday was over. He'd stopped reading that as workaholism, because it wasn't. It was just how her mind worked, continuous. And the physical location didn't change the mental activity, and the mental activity didn't mean she wasn't also here, in the kitchen, present. He was thinking about nothing in particular, the warm water, the plates, the particular domestic rhythm of a task that is simple and finite, when Sophie appeared in the kitchen doorway. She was in her pajamas. She had her sketchbook open to a page he couldn't see from where he was standing. She looked at both of them with the expression of a child who has decided something and is now implementing the decision. "I finished the drawing," she said. "Which one?" Victoria said, looking up from her laptop. Sophie held it out. It was the building interior from the opening in January. She'd been working on it in pieces since then, adding to the original drawing over the months, and he could see from across the kitchen that it was substantially more detailed than it had been. The wide doorways, the adjustable workstations, the window where she'd sat with Gerald, and the two figures near the window, the ones she'd added on opening night. But there was a third figure now, standing beside the wheelchair figure, smaller, with what appeared to be a sketchbook under its arm. Victoria looked at it for a long time. "You added yourself," she said. "We're all there," Sophie said. She pointed. "That's Dad, that's you, that's me." She paused. "I put us together because that's how it is." Nobody said anything for a moment. The kitchen held the sound of the water dripping from the drying rack and the refrigerator's new quiet rattle and the city doing its evening business outside the window. "That's how it is," Victoria said quietly. Not a question, just the words, repeated. Sophie looked at her with the directness she brought to things that mattered. "Is that okay?" Victoria's face did something complicated and true, and did not try to manage it back to neutral. "Yes," she said. "That's okay." Sophie nodded, satisfied with this information, and said she was going to bed and could someone come say goodnight in 10 minutes. And then she left, her footsteps going down the hall, and the bedroom door closed with the soft, particular sound it always made because it didn't close entirely flush with the frame, which was a quirk of the apartment Ethan had lived with for 4 years and never fixed, because it meant he could always hear it when Sophie went to bed. He finished the dishes. He dried his hands. He turned around and Victoria was looking at the drawing which Sophie had left on the table. "She put us together," Victoria said. She did. She looked up at him. Her eyes were full in the way they sometimes got when she didn't manage everything all the way down, and she didn't try to clear it. "She's right, you know," Ethan said. "That's how it is." Victoria set the drawing down carefully, the way you set down something you intend to keep. She looked at him across the kitchen. Outside the window, the city was lit in the way it was lit in May, when the days had gotten longer and the evenings held light later, and the street below was full of people who were somewhere between where they'd been and where they were going, which is where people mostly are. "I know," she said. He crossed the kitchen and she looked up at him and he sat down across from her at the table where they'd eaten dinner and done the work that mattered and had the conversations that were difficult and the ones that weren't. And they were in the same room with it now, all of it, without the crises to organize themselves around, without the next problem to solve, just the thing itself, which was not dramatic and was not perfect and was completely real. Down the hall, Sophie was waiting to be said goodnight to, which was the most immediate and concrete fact available. He said, "Come say goodnight with me." Victoria looked at him for a moment, then she closed her laptop. "Okay," she said. They went down the hall together and the bedroom door with its imperfect latch opened easily when he pushed it, and Sophie was in her bed with her book open on the pillow beside her, pretending she'd been reading it rather than waiting, which she'd been doing since she was 5 and had not yet found a reason to stop. "Finally," she said. 10 minutes, Ethan said. It was 12. "Go to sleep, Sophie." She looked at both of them in the doorway with her mother's eyes, dark and direct, and a little too perceptive for her age, and something in her face settled into the quiet satisfaction of a child whose plan has worked, though the plan, as far as anyone could tell, had been no more complicated than drawing what she actually saw and saying what she actually meant, which was the way she approached everything, and which turned out to be, as strategies go, more effective than most. "Good night," she said. "Good night," they said. He pulled the door to, leaving the inch of space it always left, and they stood in the hallway in the quiet apartment, And the city was out there doing what cities do, and the evening was what it was. Ordinary and specific and not a metaphor for anything. Just a Tuesday in May, at the end of a day, that had been a day. And Ethan Walker stood in the hallway of the place where his life actually happened and understood, without needing to examine it further, that this was enough. Not as a consolation, not as a settling for less than what he'd wanted, but as the real thing, the actual thing, the thing that people mean when they say that word and mean it honestly. It had started with a contract, with pages left on a table near a copy room, with a choice to read carefully instead of walking past. And it had become this hallway, this quiet, this woman beside him who had built something real and broken and rebuilt it and was still building, this daughter asleep behind a door that didn't close flush, this life that was small in its dimensions and vast in what it contained. You don't plan for it. That is the one thing worth saying, the thing that gets lost in every account of how people find their way back to something worth having. You don't plan for it. You just keep paying attention, keep showing up, keep doing the work in front of you with whatever honesty you have available. And one day you look up from the work, and the thing is there, not because you built it toward a design, but because all the small true things accumulated into something larger than any of them. Ethan had stopped believing in plans the day he understood that the life he'd planned was the one he was no longer living. What he had instead was this: the hallway, the quiet, the city going about its business outside, indifferent and beautiful in equal measure. He would take it. He already had.